My goal this afternoon is for you guys to not go to sleep after lunch, okay? So we're going to shift gears and move from this morning where we talked some from the row crop perspective, and I'm going to share some of the animal performance side to the project that Dr. Gamble first talked about this morning. And we're specifically going to look at post-weaning management systems for beef cattle and kind of the role of these cover crop systems and cool season annuals in that portion of development of beef cattle. All right, if I can click forward at least. There we go. It had to wake up. It was tired after lunch too. So, all right, so what is preconditioning, first of all, and why do we feel that we have opportunities for preconditioning beef cattle specifically in cover crop systems? So this is that post-weaning management phase in our beef cattle production systems. If we think about beef cattle production systems in the southeast, we have cow-calf production, then we wean those calves and we can raise them to a certain target weight before they ultimately go on to the feed yard phase. So that's going to be this preconditioning phase that we're talking about, or that post-weaning management portion. And in this, our goal is to help get more uniform management of those beef calves, improve their plane of nutrition and health before they ultimately go on to the feed yard phase. One of the challenges we've seen across the U.S. as a whole when we look at this transition from cow-calf into post-weaning management is that as these calves are weaned here in the southeast, they ultimately go on to the Midwest where they enter into a feed yard. We've seen that over time, ultimately the trends have shown still an increase in issues with animal health, specifically BRD, or bovine respiratory disease, in feed yards. And so if we take kind of a look back into prior management of those calves, when we precondition those calves before they ultimately go on to the feed yard, it helps reduce that risk of those health outcomes that become negative in that feed yard sector. Okay, so for us here in the southeast, we have the opportunity to add value to our calves post-weaning through these preconditioning systems, and specifically utilizing forages to do that. Okay, and so that can look a few different ways. First, it can be where we receive these stocker calves, or the calves that have been weaned. We purchase those calves, bring them to our operation, and then we start to, quote, straighten them out once they get to our farm. Okay, and so what does that mean? In this backgrounding system, that means that we're essentially training those calves how to eat, how to drink water, and we want them to stay healthy during that time frame. So for us, a lot of times we're purchasing those calves in the fall of the year, and then we're going to ultimately put them on winter grazing. Okay, so we have maybe a little bit of a gap before that cool season forage is available for those calves to graze. So we may put these cattle on hay and supplement or some stockpiled forage that we have on our operation before those cool season forages are available. Then we move into the stocker phase, which is traditionally the grazing-based part of this system. Okay, so we're moving out of kind of that initial period where we've gotten everybody healthy, they figured out how to eat. Now we're going to put them on this high-quality forage to really get that bloom and get that growth in those cattle during that time frame. And that's the opportunity where I see the cover crop system being a fit for us from the backgrounding perspective. So thinking about comparison of these systems, if we are receiving these calves in the fall of the year, that's typically when we're in our warm season perennial grass-based system, so Bahia grass. The fall is when that Bahia grass is going down in terms of production as well as quality. Okay, and so those summer forages, we may still be able to get some gain out of those, depending on when we receive those cattle and put them on pasture. 1 to 2 pounds per day of average daily gain. But then we may either have to shift into a dry lot temporarily before that cool season forage is available, or if we have some of that stockpiled forage that I mentioned, maybe we can utilize that before they go on to those cool season forages. Okay, so that kind of receiving time frame then, we're typically looking at really just getting those cattle straightened out, used to living on our farm, and we're hoping to get kind of these target gains maybe between 1 to 2 to 2.5 pounds during that time frame. The opportunity in the stocker cattle are high in terms of growth for those animals, because when we take that animal post-weaning, that is the time when we still have some growth potential in those animals. And so we can see that if we want to target some of these average daily gains, what we have shown here in this table is just a table of overall nutrient requirements of these stocker calves depending upon the weight of those animals at the time of receiving. So we have to ask ourselves, what is our production goal then for those calves to have a target gain during that time period that we're owning them? And in order to achieve a greater level of gain, we have to have a greater level of quality to be able to do that. Okay? So where do forages then come in this? I mentioned our grass-based system here in this region is primarily based on Bahia grass, but we can look at complementing that with other forages that are available. So I've always really loved this figure. It's from the Southern Forages book, but it does a nice job of demonstrating some of the quality differences that we see in our forage systems here in the Southeast region. So with our warm season perennial grasses, those are going to be their greatest quality at the beginning of the growing season, early in the summer, and then decline as we move closer to dormancy. Whereas these cool season annuals specifically are a nice complement to those warm season perennials. They have a high level of digestibility as well as moderate to high crude protein levels associated with them, which is going to help support that gain for stocker calves. And so both our cool season annual grasses as well as legumes are shown on this particular figure. When we're talking about cover crop systems specifically, one of the things we want to look at is diversity in those systems. So we might not just be exclusive to these cool season annual grasses. Maybe we're adding in some things like crimson clover that we saw earlier today. We're adding in some other species to help lengthen that growing season, but also improve quality as we see here. Okay, so what does this look like for us? This is just an example of a project that we've conducted at the Wiregrass Research and Extension Center. And I wanted you to think about it on a calendar production basis of if we're receiving cattle in the fall of the year, where do they go from the time that we get them until the time that they go through that cool season grazing and we ultimately market them in the late spring or early summer. Okay, so if I'm receiving them for a 45-day backgrounding period, then they go into cool season pastures. They could go on to hay or hay plus supplement during that time, or stockpile grazing before going into a cover crop system. For the station, we look at utilizing this system, one, because we are doing active research with grazing cover crops, but typically in the fall of the year, in October, we put a bid out for contract grazing cattle, and we bring in a group of steers during that time to kind of be held and backgrounded before our cool season forage is ready to be grazed in those cover crop systems. So this is what that protocol looks like for us. This would be very specific to your respective operation, but I would encourage you to work with your veterinarian to develop a plan for receiving these cattle, what types of vaccinations they would need to have at receiving for your respective operation, and then getting them used to your system, okay? So helping them learn where the fences are, where the waters are. Having that infrastructure in place is important for this receiving management phase. When we look at where do the cattle go then once they get here on the research farm, we really have tried to emphasize looking at extending the grazing season in any way possible on this research farm. So we stockpile Bermuda grass at the Wiregrass Research Center, and that is a way that when we're receiving these cattle, they can have some grazing until that cool season forage is available. Okay, so this is just a picture of what stockpiled Bermuda grass looks like. This is a field of Tifton 85 Bermuda grass where we've done that. You can see that we have some temporary fencing here, so we have a lot of that stockpiled forage that's out there in the pasture. We don't want the cattle to have access to that at all times to trample and to kind of cherry pick what they want to eat out of that. We want to give it to them a section at a time so they are truly going through and getting the best utilization out of that they can. Okay, so you might ask, well, Kim, you just said that stocker cattle, they have a high nutrient requirement for gain, and you're putting them on this warm season forage that's stacked up in a pile. What type of gain am I actually going to get out of that? Okay, so in this study, first we saw that it allowed us to have an additional 40 to 50 days of grazing during the fall months, so from November to early January on this stockpile, and we were able to get about a pound per day of average daily gain out of those calves. Okay, so it's not a lot, but we weren't feeding hay and supplement during that time. Okay, we were still supplementing the cattle, but we didn't supplement the whole time. Okay, so when we received the cattle at the beginning of November, we were able to graze for about a month before we started providing soy hulls at 1% of body weight to these calves. Okay, so the reason we did that is because, as we know, when we get into November and December, starts to rain, right? Picks back up. So the quality of that stockpile Bermuda grass was declining. So we started providing some additional energy supplementation to the calves, but then allowing them to meet that roughage requirement from that stockpiled forage. Okay, so that's kind of how we got started then with this stocker phase, where they ultimately then go onto a grazed cover crop system. Some of the reasons I think cool season annuals are very important, particularly from the cover crop perspective for a beef cattle producer, is because they can provide good production season length, quality, and then the soil benefits that we talked about earlier as well. So really, if you look at it, we have the same goals in some respects, right? So these are all things that I think from a row crop perspective, we would also value as part of this system. When we look at the growth distribution of cool season forages, for us, I mentioned earlier, diversity is something we want to consider in these systems. So we know that our small grain forages tend to be earlier. And when we first started doing a lot of cool season forage work at this station, we were not doing it as part of this integrated cover crop system. Okay, so we were looking at things like small grains and ryegrass together to be able to provide that extended length, okay, which works fine, but it doesn't work very well in that cover crop system where we're coming in and wanting to terminate that to be able to plant row crops. Okay, so with that goal in mind then, we're thinking about the application for the crops and the cattle systems together and what that might look like. Okay, and so we know that in these systems, with our row crop production system, we have winter cover crops, and then we have on the beef cattle side, we're going to graze some winter annuals, whether we're overseeding our Bahia grass system or we're looking at prepared seed bed scenario. So this is just putting those winter annuals in a different spot maybe than normally what we would traditionally think about. So for the Wiregrass Research Center, this is the study that Dr. Gamble brought up earlier, that we looked at the integration of these two systems, and we looked at that diverse mixture that contained both small grains, so our cereal rye, and then Cossack oats and crimson clover and T. raptor brassica. So this is just a picture of what the field looked like. You can see we had good species diversity there. And the reason we chose those species was to try to get some modulation in the growing season of those species and their specific grazing availability. Okay, so for me, we shared some of these pictures earlier, but I think the important part is when we look at this project, the control that had no grazing, and then looking at different cattle removal dates in that, you can just see from these images that whenever we removed the cattle from the project, and then in the case of the mid-February and the mid-March removal dates, that cover crop was still allowed to accumulate until the time of termination, close to the time when the row crops would be planted. Okay, so you'll see that just naturally, the earlier that we were able to terminate grazing, the more biomass was able to still come back and accumulate in that system. But when I look at these pictures, something that I really think is important is, again, that diversity that I see in these mixtures. Okay, so I see a lot of biomass out there, which means I have a lot of forage for the animals to eat. And not only that, but it's a lot of quality forage. Okay, so they can go through, they can select in that what they want to eat out of it. And then when I go and I terminate that crop, I still may have some opportunity for additional biomass to accumulate before we go in to put in the row crop. So this is just that natural progression of what the fields looked like based on those different cattle removal dates. You know, you can see as we go into the spring a little bit more, we start to see a bit more of those brassicas that are coming in, and they're a lot more visible to us. And so this is what the field looked like then at termination. The amount of residue was obviously dependent upon these treatments and when the cattle were removed, and the number of grazing or the number of accumulation days that were then left after that termination. So we see this is a picture of what the forage species growth distribution looked like during the growing season. And there was a question about this earlier, so I think that it's important to show that those small grains were available very early, and then we started to get more growth distribution from things like our crimson clover and our brassicas as we moved later into the growing season. So it shows that quality changes of those forages throughout the growing season for this system. Okay, so here's the big slide, big takeaway, I guess, from this, from the animal perspective, is when we look at the overall gain per acre and then the average daily gain in the system, when we look at the mid-April date, we were able to get greater compensatory gain in these calves the longer we were able to graze. Okay, so that's something that I heard earlier that was discussed. Like, I'm going to be focused on wanting to maximize the number of grazing days I can get. But we have to figure out where we are together in this conversation and trying to find some common ground about what that needs to look like if it is two individuals who are having this discussion. But overall, the average daily gain that we saw across treatments and then gain per acre was quite good, really across all of the different removal dates that we saw in this study, but with the mid-April having the greatest animal performance in totality. Okay, another perspective I wanted to provide is thinking about these backgrounding systems. The example I just gave was with contract grazing of steers for us at the research farm. But we can also utilize these systems for heifer development. Okay? And that's important for us because the heifer is the future of our operation. And again, we want to maximize the use of forages in her growth and development. A question I would often get about heifer development is, okay, well, what's the best way to do that? How can I go about that? The biggest thing is that some of the goals are the same for that post-weaning phase where we're weaning that calf, and we're trying to now develop her to a target weight for breeding, okay? And this figure just shows us that we just need her to reach that target weight over a certain period of time, okay? So she could grow fairly quickly, and then we could level off that gain to meet that target weight. She could grow on a steady plane to meet the target weight, or we could maybe have that calf growing a little bit more slowly, then pick up the nutritional plane on her closer to getting to that target weight. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways we can do this, and this is important from a forage perspective because it means we have flexibility. Okay, so maybe I can use some lower quality forages at first in that development of this heifer, then move to a higher quality forage to pick up and get the gain to get her to that target breeding weight. And I think that's a very applicable scenario for us here. So thinking about it from a nutritional perspective, we've touched on weaning and weaning stress associated with that time when that calf is removed from the cow. Once we get through that stressful period, then we're looking at a good goal is 1.25 to 1.5 pounds per day for her until breeding to be able to achieve at least 65% of that target weight. Okay, so this can be done with pasture alone, or it can be done with a combination of tools that you have at your disposal, which might include hay and supplemental feed. So same figure I showed you earlier, but this time I've just overlaid what are those heifers' nutrient requirements and which systems may be able to be utilized to meet certain gain goals for replacement heifer development. And it's really the same story. You'll see that with increasing average daily gain requirements for those heifers, we need to have an increased plane of nutrition, and our cool season forages are very adept to be able to help us get there. Okay, so this is an example of a project that we conducted at the Sand Mountain Research and Extension Center in North Alabama. This is also a big row crop production area for us in the state. This particular project was not done in a cover crop system, but it is using cool season annuals in a prepared seed bed, and I think would be a good example of the type of performance we might expect to see when we take those heifers and put them on cool season forages for development. So in this study, we looked at either using novel endophyte infected tall fescue, which is a cool season perennial grass, or most applicable to us here, I think, would be our small grains and annual ryegrass as a way to help develop these heifers. And this was just a demonstration project where we brought in producers' heifers from the region. We put them on those different cool season forage systems, and then our goal was based on the entry weight of those heifers was to get them to 65% of their mature body weight, breed them, and then we sent them home. And then later we asked the producers some questions about how did it go? Did you keep her? Did you not? What did you do with that heifer? So the point of this is just to look at what was the grazing season length we were able to get out of those small grains or ryegrass system here. It varied from year to year, but the least number of grazing days we had was following an extreme drought year, and we only had 70 days of grazing that year. But on average, it was at least 100 days of grazing we were able to get out of those cool season forage systems. The average daily gain is another piece that I wanted you to look at here. So you can see that from the average daily gain perspective, we had a range of 1.6 to 1.9 pounds per day of average daily gain. Okay, so we weren't necessarily blowing it out of the park in terms of gain on these heifers, nor would we really want to. We want them to just kind of have that steady progression as we showed in that figure before. So this was a great example of how these systems allowed us to do that and to help get them to that target weight. Okay, so this is just a little bit more information then of, I mentioned we're trying to get them to a certain percentage of their body weight at breeding. Did we meet that target based on that number of grazing days that I showed you? And we did. So we were able to get them to at least 65% of their expected mature body weight at the time of breeding, which was in the late spring, early summer time frame. Okay, so then we sent the heifers home, and we still know, though, that there's some work to do. Okay, so we didn't just develop them and breed them and then kick them out and say good luck. They're still growing during that time. Okay, so we still have to continue that nutrition for the heifer, whether they come off of this cool season forage system and then go maybe back into a warm season perennial system. We want to make sure they're maintaining a similar plane of nutrition as we go forward into that next phase. Okay, so we're still targeting that continued growth, 1 to 1.5 pounds per day of average daily gain. And now we want her to be 85% of her mature body weight at the time of calving. Okay. So this is just some data from producers that we got back of whenever those heifers left the station. This is from 2019 in the demonstration project. But whenever they left the center, the 6/19/19 weight was the weight when they left, their expected mature weight in the next column, and then their weight at calving. Okay? And so it just gives you a good average to actually show us how much did they gain between the time they left the research farm and when they actually had a calf. So again, their level of production, it varied some from heifer to heifer, but overall we can see, again, we don't have to have a really high target. We just need to be consistently trying to work towards that 1 to 1.5 pounds per day average daily gain. Okay, so in terms of general targets then for these heifers, those are really the key time points I have in mind, is thinking about the weight at weaning. What do I need to do between weaning to get her to 65% of her mature weight, and then knowing that she needs to be about 85% of her mature weight at calving. We can utilize high quality forages to help meet various sections of these goals. Okay, so depending on the calendar year, depending upon the calving season and production cycle for your operation, that's what I'd ask you to think about is where do the cool season forages fit in to help make that happen. Okay? Knowing the weight of these cattle is very important too. That's something that we've seen consistently across the board, whether we were looking at backgrounding these cattle in the cover crop system or these examples with heifer development that I just showed you as well. We have to have that as our starting point to know those production goals. Okay, so in summary, I really think there's a lot of opportunities for the use of cool season forages in beef cattle systems, particularly when we look at it from the perspective of cover crops. I hope this has given you some additional things to think about from a production, quality, and animal performance standpoint that we might expect in these systems. There was a comment earlier about the value of cattle currently and how great value they have and are expected to continue to have into the spring. So this is an opportunity I think that we specifically have this year, but it allows us to think about the value of forages as a whole from that year-round grazing management perspective. So with that, I'd be glad to take any questions that you might have.
Let's give our speaker a round of applause.